Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. So yeah, I'm giving this paper today on behalf of myself and Alex Arnall, a colleague at Reading, and the paper's looking at managed retreat in a small village in North Wales in the UK, and we're going to be applying a kind of naming, blaming, claiming, and framing framework to the paper, which builds on an earlier paper that we've done, which I'll come on to a link to that in a little while. But just to start with a map, because many of you may not know where Fairbourne is in Wales. So you can see there it's a small coastal community, kind of mid to North Wales, really, very much backing on to the Snowdonia National Park. It's a community which is a distinct threat from sea level rise, although we'll go on to see in a minute that that's very much contested, the degree at which it's at risk. But you can see from this particular photo that there is, particularly at, with high spring tides, there's a very distinct possibility of flooding and overtopping, particularly at this right-hand corner of the village. You can just see in this slide the left-hand corner of the village, which is actually pretty much below sea level. So that sea wall that you can see there is very much protective of the village. The paper basically looks at this idea of conflict that arises very much with managed retreats, and is conflict with local communities is very common with managed retreat decisions, and we draw on this naming, blaming, and claiming literature from the law and society literature, actually, which provides important insights into the way in which conflicts emerge, and in that literature, it's very much about how those conflicts can end up in court. And obviously litigation, things ending up in court, is one form of claims making. We're interested in claims making in this context in a broader sense. The villagers in this community did look at litigating at one point as part of their claims making, but we're interested in claims making beyond just court proceedings. So we'll be thinking about the types of claims making that the community was engaged in. We're also interested in applying framing on top of that, that conceptual framework, and particularly the ideas of diagnostic and prognostic framing. In other words, how is the problem constructed, and then what are the ideas about how that problem should be sorted out going forward. That's basically what those two involve. So this is the paper that we produced earlier that set out some of the kind of early ideas on claims making, and this idea of naming and blaming and claiming. We've applied those ideas in empirical field work we carried out in Fairbourne. And the context for this really is that there was a decision by local government in the area that they would provide no active intervention to maintain those sea walls you saw in that earlier photo beyond the year 2054. So that decision had an immediate effect on the community. It damaged house prices. It left the community in a state of limbo, in effect. And the assumption was that on the part of the local authority that the village would need to be decommissioned and its residents would be resettled. So yeah, this was very much a decision about managed retreat and not holding the line in terms of protecting those sea defences and maintaining them. Okay, so that's another photo where you can see that the village is actually below sea level rise, and you can see the sea defences to the left of that photo. That gives you another picture on the slides of the sea defences, and you can see the kind of Snowdonia hill range in the distance there. So I think what we had here was a situation of conflict between the local authorities and the local community. If you look at it in framing terms, the local authorities were naming or diagnostically framing the problem in Fairbourne as one of climate-induced sea level rise. The sea level was rising. This was going to cause a problem to Fairbourne in the future in terms of coastal flooding and inundation, and therefore there had to be this managed retreat. And that was their prognostic frame. That's effectively what they thought should follow on from that initial diagnostic frame. How did the community respond to that? Well, the community was basically challenging the apparent inevitability of that logic. So there wasn't any sense in which they deny climate change is a real phenomenon. They're not climate deniers or even climate delayers. But they weren't prepared to name or diagnose, again, in terms of diagnostic framing, they weren't prepared to identify sea level rise as a problem that was inevitably going to hit the village and cause it problems in the future. And because of that, because they were not prepared to concede that sea level rise was going to be a problem here, they therefore also challenged the retreat element, the prognostic solution that the local authority had fastened on. So I think the framing literature takes one so far and is quite useful in thinking about managed retreat in those terms. But I think one of the things that our paper tries to do is to add in the blaming and claiming part. And I think in relation to blaming, one of the key gripes that the community had here was the way in which actually for a so-called managed retreat, there really was no managed solution in place here. The local authority had made the decision with the deadline of 2054, but they basically provided no roadmap as to how retreat would happen and in what ways it would be phased, what kind of buyouts would occur and so on. So the managed part was very much not there. And I think that policy vacuum, if you like, that planning vacuum led to the community putting forward a number of their own solutions or claims. And those claims were varied. So partly they were thinking about compensation and they were thinking of litigation actually at that point at one stage. But I think the expense of that turned out to be too much to bring proceedings. They were looking for reduced council tax on the homes. Some of the solutions were, I think, slightly fanciful, you might say. And the top one there about publishing the public purchase of farmland in the national park, the Snowdonia National Park, behind the village to allow the whole village to kind of move on to this farmland as a village. I think that will be very challenging in planning or in zoning terms in US terminology. So yeah, they put forward a number of claims of their own though, and I think that it is a really interesting thing that we found, that those claims were many and varied. So where did we reach in terms of the conclusion from the paper? Well, in terms of kind of climate justice and particularly procedural justice, it's obvious that public authorities, local authorities, have a duty to involve communities in decision-making on managed retreats. And that, they did that here in a reasonably kind of tokenistic way, I think. So they set up events locally to try and tick that box, but the community never really felt that they were being properly engaged with there. And I think one of the reasons they felt that they weren't being properly engaged with was that the public authorities never gave them a clear idea on precisely how retreat would actually be managed. So what happened there, in effect, was that the managed retreat was being linked to market forces. There really wasn't any formal planning, so it was a form of non-managed retreat. And the authorities were very much blamed for that lack of concrete plans. And yeah, the community made claims offering their own solution. So I think, and this is my final slide, I think what we would say is that framing and the literature on framing is actually quite a good way of studying cases of conflict in managed retreat. And the reason for that is because those conflicts are often disagreements related to how problems are presented and represented, and that's really very much what framing is about. The council here was essentially trying to close down debate by themselves dictating what the future would look like and should look like, and effectively saying that there was not much that could be done. You know, the retreat was what should be done, and that was all that was on offer. And the community was very much contesting that representation of events and trying to come up with its own creative solutions and putting those forwards in the community's claim making. And I think, you know, some of those claims were more realistic than others, but I think in the absence of proper formal engagement by the public authorities with the local community, that was always going to be the case. I think we felt that some of those exaggerated claims would be put forward because nobody was really giving a clear steer on which ones might work and which ones wouldn't. Great, and I finish there. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Betsy Priem. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. And I'm here with my co-authors, Erica Bauer from Stanford and Rachel Harrington-Abrams from King's College London. And we're here to present on a framework that might be helpful for interrogating community at a deeper level than maybe it currently is, and proposing something that will give a better conceptual framework for how to make community engagement more meaningful. So I probably don't need to belabor the point, but planned relocation is happening, and it's going to continue in its frequency as we navigate through a climate changing world. There's already 400 plus cases known on every inhabitable continent. And in this space, the literature that discusses this, community is a buzzword. It's pretty much everywhere on every document, and yet the clear definition on what that actually means is not currently in place. And so we've seen in other areas tangential to planned relocation work, such as development and disaster work, that community as a concept is being challenged. And so we're picking up on that conversation and hoping to bring it forward into the planned relocation and managed retreat discussions. So in this project, my co-authors and I are trying to look within our respective disciplines and look to see what is in the scholarship on community work and community engagement, and look to the policy area that's focused on managed retreat and planned relocations, and try to come up with a more comprehensive framework that would help foster community engagement. So a common framework that seems to be in this space already on planned relocation and managed retreat is that it's set up in a way that there's two distinct groups. So you've got your internal actors and your external actors. So primarily when you're asking, okay, so who is the relocating community? And you've probably heard, or at least I've heard in different sessions already at this conference, it's those with the lived expertise. It's the lived experts, or it's the buyout recipients, and that's in one camp. And then when you're asking who's facilitating the relocation process, that would be the learned experts or the buyout managers, the buyout facilitators. And so there's these two distinct camps, and the way that it's currently being framed in terms of engagement is that if there's any interaction between the two, then that's what constitutes community engagement. And so we're hoping to complicate that a little bit, or to invite more conversation around what this current paradigm actually looks like in practice, and maybe highlight some of the challenges that we've seen in the cases that we've studied. So to dive first into the question around who is the relocating community. So the definition of, oh, I'm sorry, there's this still at the top. Can I remove this? Alt. That didn't work. The X. Do I hit end? No. Oh. Okay. Oh, wow. Thank you, everyone. Community, however we define it. Okay, so going back to this, thank you for your patience, everyone. Looking at the first question, who is the relocating community? So the definition of community is very fluid in lots of different contexts, not just planned relocation. In my area of urban sociology, it can mean anything from something geographically bound, social network bound, culturally shared interest. There's lots of different meanings that can take on the form of community. And some issues that come up with this is that when you're talking about a planned relocation or a managed retreat, it creates these inconsistent operating frameworks that make it very difficult for all of the actors. If you keep that simple model of the internal and external actors, if you have different definitions of what community actually is, the way that you proceed and progress forward in your relocation process might yield undesirable outcomes for one or both of those groups. There's another potential for community washing, which is where community is used so ubiquitously that it loses its meaning almost entirely, or the power behind what community actually means no longer holds the same value. Another issue we wanted to highlight is this assumption of homogeneity. So in referencing community very broadly and having poorly defined or ambiguous definitions around it, it can mask some of the internal power dynamics and might have a misleading representation of what those within the community or those who will have to relocate actually want out of the process. And so this illusion of consensus can have really damaging effects on the way that community engagement plays out over the long term. So the second piece, when you look at those on the external side and who is facilitating the relocation process, again, it's typically thought of as NGOs, local governments, national governments at all different levels. And this list is not, comprehensive, but basically those who are not being asked to relocate and who are maybe the technical assistance providers in the relocation. And any interaction between them and the community members is considered meaningful engagement. But we would like to argue that maybe there's an intermediary group that spans both of these distances and actually does some of the more meaningful engagement, and that would be a more targeted area to focus on if you are doing research or a practitioner trying to have more meaningful engagement. This area and this overlap between the green and yellow of community leaders and the green and blue on the other side, that would be a more focused area for targeting meaningful engagement. And another point on this is that in this kind of green space of the intermediaries where it's the leadership involved in the relocation process, the way that that's structured has a direct impact on that, on the engagement itself. So then what would this mean for how community engagement can be meaningful over time? Well, there's some pitfalls, as there were in defining community. There's definitely pitfalls in thinking about who the local leadership is in these spaces, who the intermediaries are, and what that means for meaningful engagement. So one key challenge is that there might be a trust in the local representation. So You might be very familiar with the Newtok case or the Shishmaref case in Alaska, where some transitions in local leadership made it very difficult for those who identified as the community members to feel represented throughout the entirety of the process in the relocation planning. We also saw an example of this in Colombia. After a landslide, there was a change in the local leadership after elections, where the local leader was then a representative of a minority fraction of the population who was actually opposed to retreat. So the dynamics shift over time, and trust can morph along the way. Another challenge would be elite capture. And this relates back to community washing. And there was actually a really excellent study in Boston by a sociologist who was looking at community development. And in the community washing, where community was used ubiquitously and ill-defined and had multiple operating frameworks, it led to elite capture, where some external interests that were not related to the facilitators or the community members looking to relocate kind of co-opted the phrase and were able to then use that phrase to create a bit of a bureaucratic facade where it looked like community engagement was happening. They were ticking the box that we were involving the community, but it reduced the authority of the community to have decision-making power over their process dramatically. So that's another challenge to consider. So the last thing that I kind of want to hit on with this is with how community engagement can be meaningful over time is to consider both the type and the issue of temporality. So one suggestion that we have within this framework would be to borrow from Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. It's not being shared. All right, we're going to pause for more technical difficulties. Are we there, Trey? All right, wonderful. Great. The last point here is that you might want to keep in mind the types and the temporality. So to borrow from Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, and this is more formalized in the McAdam and Ferris 2015 Spectrum on Planned Relocation, there's this ladder of community participation that might be helpful in framing these conversations. So we're thinking about this as both a useful tool that practitioners could bring when they're having discussions with community members to have a shared framework around, you know, where are we in this process? Where do we want to go? How can we facilitate that and have a collaborative approach to make moves to have the community engagement be along this spectrum? And then also in thinking about it more abstractly, this might be a useful tool to have it be scalable across different types of planned relocation. So we've heard a lot about the indigenous populations, and that, you know, could arguably be where there's a more clear sense of a shared cultural definition of community. But if you move to more densely populated areas or where there's more heterogeneity in terms of who's constitutes the community or the people being asked to relocate, there might be less shared values or a shared sense of community. And it might not be as advantageous for that population to have complete local initiative in control, because it would stall progress or halt in some way. So using it both as a tool for practitioners and for researchers to kind of frame the conversation and thinking about what community engagement would look like in their context. And to the point of temporality, this is not just a one-time thing where you check the box that this happened at the beginning, people were just involved in the conversations, but this happens throughout each phase of the process. And so this might be a helpful anchoring point to recheck in with populations at different points in the process to see if there's been any dynamics that have shifted things up or down or left or right, or, you know, whatever it is, to continue to have deeper engagement. So just to summarize, the key questions that are in the common paradigm and the way that things are approached, it is helpful to probe a little deeper and maybe frame things around something that lends to a more to a deeper conceptual model that can make community engagement more meaningful. Thank you for your patience with all of the technical difficulties, and please do contact us with any questions. Great, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I'm David Casagrande, and I'm going to be talking about some research we've been doing on managed retreat. And when I say we, I'm referring to a couple of colleagues. I've been working with Nicholas Pinter from the University of California at Davis, Heather McElvain-Newsad at Western Illinois University, and Aaron Lampman at Washington College in Maryland. And we've been collaborating in various research projects for about 8 years now. And so what I'm going to talk about, two case studies. I'm going to try to very quickly talk about the work we've done in the Midwest, and then work we're doing right now on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I just want to point out that we've been studying sort of all phases of the managed retreat process, from how people reach consensus to following up years after, how happy people are with the relocations. But what I want to focus on in these 12 minutes are just the sort of precursors, or what are some of the impediments to actually reaching consensus to go ahead and try to do a managed retreat. And a lot of what I'll talk about relates very closely to the previous presentation about framing, and I'll be using some theoretical concepts. Yeah. So I wasn't going to show this slide, but then I decided I might as well. Everybody knows most of these things, but I just want to remind everybody that there are good reasons for managed retreat, and one that I don't hear talked about a lot is the idea that we're seeing a lot of state agencies, in particular state departments of transportation, having to make decisions about strategic disinvestment, and managed retreat is a really important part of that process. So I just want to remind everybody about that. I'm definitely not going to go through this whole slide because there's been multiple presentations about the FEMA buyout process, but I do want to point out that the case studies that we've been looking at are pretty much based entirely on the FEMA buyout process, including Valmeyer, Illinois. So we're asking two general questions. What, in this presentation at least, what are some of the impediments to relocation, and what are the socio-psychological processes that shape risk and attitudes about relocation? Or I could actually say the processes that actually shape the way the discourse is framed, as that was discussed in the previous presentation. So for theoretical background, some of you might have remembered Mary Douglas from a long time ago. This idea that risk is actually a cultural construction. It's constructed as a part of a socio-political process, and so people will pay attention to different types of risks based on their identity of the groups that they belong to. So this is something that was proposed in the 1980s, and there's been this actually is a theoretical paradigm that pretty much dominates the risk analysis, social research on risk analysis. So we're drawing very heavily on this idea that people are constructing their idea of risk based on the groups that they belong to. And I use a lot in my research cognitive dissonance theory, originally proposed by Leon Festinger. And so there's been thousands of psychology experiments conducted on cognitive dissonance. Almost none of them focus on what Leon Festinger was really trying to emphasize, was this social aspect of when your beliefs are completely disconfirmed, why do you not change them? And in fact, one of the things he found in his case study, which was Marion Keech was this person who channeled information from another planet. And all these people believed that the world was going to end on like December 26th or something, 1958. And when the world didn't end, people didn't change their beliefs. They actually tried to get other people to believe what they believe by proselytizing. So very interesting stuff that's almost ignored in the psychological literature. And finally, I'm going to introduce this idea of structural bias, which we see a lot. Engineers talk about, people talk about structural bias in engineering, but we're also applying this concept to people, the general public, preferring structural solutions. Instead of having to make very difficult decisions, they go to the structural solutions first. So the first case study is in the Midwest, mostly in Illinois, Missouri, Iowa. This is the Mississippi River Basin, which obviously floods a lot. In this particular project, it was a multi-year project. It was an ethnographic approach. We did focus groups, interviews, including, I should mention that Dennis Knobloch, who was the mayor of Valmeyer during the relocation, some of you might have heard about, he was actually a co-PI on this NSF grant. And so we've done a lot of, we've been in depth in the Valmeyer process. And we also, we did a structured survey that I'll talk about in a minute. And we did modeling. And one of the things we were able to do was actually model the flood risk for individual properties. And then in our survey, be able to attach that address to the answers that people give. So this is an example of actually, we know what people's physical risks are, and we can compare that to their actual perceptions of their own risk to find out, is their perception of risk wrong, and is that an impediment to thinking about a managed retreat? So I'll talk about the quantitative results in just a second. We did a lot of interviews. We used grounded theory and Vivo to analyze the transcribed interviews, and so we saw some discursive themes arose, and so this is, again, this idea that people are they have their own individual beliefs, but the way they act on those beliefs is actually filtered through social processes, and one of them was social comparison. And so this was just to give you an example. I was actually interviewing a person who had the levee had broken several years ago. And the town had completely flooded. And while the town was flooded, a tornado came through. This is the Midwest, and wiped out sort of what was left, that wasn't flooded. And I was interviewing this woman on her front porch, and I said, "Well, don't you think this is a dangerous place to live?" And she said, "Oh, no. It's not as dangerous as California. California has earthquakes and landslides and wildfires and all this other kind of stuff." And so it actually got me really thinking, how bad does a place have to be to actually consider it to be dangerous? I mean, does there actually have to be sharks in the tornado when the town is flooded? The other thing people talked about a lot, and this is something a lot of other research has documented, quality of life, a community sense of place, but something I really want to emphasize is this idea that a lot of this was tied to institutions. And when we talk about managed retreat, we're not just talking about moving people or houses, we're talking about moving institutions, schools, churches, all kinds of things like that. And so daycare, perhaps. And so this is something that people talk about a lot, and I just want to throw that out there. We know that time is an impediment to actually doing the relocation process. Interestingly, and a lot of people didn't really talk about their risk to their life. What they were more concerned about was the risk to the equity of their home. And that was actually a major driver for really considering relocation or not. Just very quickly, what we found was that people's actual risk correlated very strongly with their perceived risk. So this is important. People know what their flood risk is, and yet most of them do not have flood insurance. 39% of the people who responded they were likely to be flooded in the next 15 years had flood insurance. And almost all of them, about 96%, had flood insurance because it was required for their mortgage. So this is, again, this bounded rationality idea. They know what their risk is, and they're doing future discounting. Basically, they're just not buying the insurance. And so when we think about managed retreat, a lot of people know what their risk is, but that's not what's really motivating their attitudes. Okay, so for time, I'm going to skip through most of these and just point out that risk perception is heavily financialized in what people would call a hyper-capitalist culture. And so if you really want to talk about risk, it's about the equity of the home. And although this is important, a lot of people also talked about things like, well, I wouldn't take a buyout because it would be, I would be abandoning my community. People would think I'm a traitor, and so on and so forth. So one of the things we found with the success story in Valmeyer was you can overcome a lot of these problems, like loss of tax base, the idea that you're bailing on your neighbors and everything, if you do it all together as a community-based relocation. Valmeyer is a town that was wiped out in 1993, 900 people. They moved the whole town they bought the farm that evidently they didn't want to do in England, and moved the town to the farm. As always, at least 6 homes are still in the floodplain, but it's one of the more successful case stories because they moved the institutions. That was really important. Once the churches and the local businesses said they were going to move, then all the residents realized that it was actually relocation of the community. So that's kind of what's happening in the Midwest. I want to talk briefly about the eastern shore of Maryland. And for those of you who might not know, there's a tectonic subsidence happening. And so the eastern shore of Maryland is sinking, and so sea level is rising. So the relative sea level rise is very quick, one of the fastest in the country. And this particular county, Dorchester County, it's estimated that about 60% of the county will be pretty much permanently inundated within the next 30 years. And so this is an area you think people would be taking this very seriously. And this is manifesting itself as higher tides, more frequent spring tides, king tides, sunny day flooding. There's all these different words for it. And it shows up with things like, people's front lawns are turning into salt marshes. A lot of ghost forests. When you drive around this area, you see all these dead trees because the salt water is coming into the groundwater. And then there's a lot of times when you just can't get to your business because the tide is too high. I show this slide was given to us by a woman we interviewed. At least 2 or 3 days a month, the school bus cannot get to her house. She actually has to put her kid in a canoe and take the child to the school bus. She's desperate for a buyout. Oh no, I touched a button. She's desperate for a buyout, but her county officials have voted twice not to approve the buyout packages that were put together by the state. So this is an example of a person within the community who's been marginalized. So here we have not yet done a quantitative survey. We failed to get funding. If anybody in the room has funding, if you want to know the answer. But we did interviews, focus groups, and I should point out that we interviewed homeowners, business owners, policymakers, emergency management agents, everybody who's sort of involved in the decision-making process. And here, we saw a lot of evidence for this idea of cognitive dissonance. People see the sea level is rising, and yet they don't want to believe that this community that they've been in the case of Smith Island, it was founded by Captain Smith in the 1600s. Smith Island cake is the official dessert of Maryland, by the way. And so these people, they see this as an existential threat. And so rather than deal with that, they engage in all kinds of social processes by which they normalize or tend not to think about these cognitive dissonances. And so they deny that sea level is rising. Not everybody, but enough of the people who influence the decision-making process, and in particular, the county commissioners who vote on whether or not, because these are all unincorporated communities. And they see the problem as erosion, not sea level rise. And erosion is a very big problem, perhaps because of sea level rise. But it's something you can see very, very clearly, in addition to the ghost forests and the salt marshes and all this other kind of stuff. And one of the reasons they blame it on erosion is because that's something you can actually convince the Army Corps of Engineers to do some sort of a structural project. And so on Smith Island, they actually successfully lobbied the Army Corps of Engineers to put in a $2.4 million shoreline stabilization project in an area that's probably going to be pretty much completely inundated by high tides within about 10 years. So the only thing I want to mention is that people really talked about this idea of this just is something that we all pull together as a community to deal with. And through that process of pulling together, they tend to normalize these high tides. And they do things like they buy special cars that only cost $500 that you can drive around, and you don't have to worry about ruining the axles in the salt water. And all this other kind of stuff. People actually work with each other to bring their kids to the school bus on those days when the buses can't get there. But this is becoming more and more problematic because you have issues where emergency personnel cannot get fire engines and ambulances to houses certain days of the week, of the month. And so it's something that you'd think people would be motivated to do something about, but instead they're engaging in these discursive behaviors of saying the problem is erosion, and it's something we can deal with. We've been here for hundreds of years. So in conclusion, I wanted to just sort of highlight this idea that communities are heterogeneous, and this is a process by which, through a discursive process, people can be marginalized, and we have to think a little bit separately when we're looking at these data between what people might say as an individual on a survey and what's actually happening as a result of a social process to construct resistance, to manage retreat. Thank you very much. Oh, I should point out, so we had 6 speakers in this session. At least 2 have not shown up, but we're trying to keep to the 12-minute, we're trying to keep each one to 12 minutes anyway, so that we might have time at the end for questions. I don't know if our next online speaker is here or not. She's ready. Okay.
Okay, I am ready to share my screen. Okay. And I think, can people hear me all right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Amazing. And can you see my screen? Oh, super duper. Hey, everyone. The last speaker on the end of your conference experience. My name is Angela Danilick. I'm a biologist with the city of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. So I'm calling in from the West Coast. Oh yes, I get to see people. Yay. Look at all your glorious faces sitting in and what looks like to be a beautiful, beautiful day. I'm joining you from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And it's really nice to be here. Day 2 of summer is warming up on the West Coast. And although we're looking forward to potentially a long, dry, hot summer, it's just nice to see that sun. So I'm here to talk about a project that I ran in collaboration with others at the City of Vancouver last year. It's called the Sea to City Design Challenge. And here's the arc that I'm going to take you in, but I hope that I'll be able to share a model of public engagement and planning around adaptation to coastal, or adaptation to sea level rise with the managed retreat, as well as some tools and tactics around decolonization and design. So first, a little bit about us here on the West Coast. We're not experiencing, at least in a settler timeframe, we haven't experienced significant flooding in Vancouver, but we know it's coming. We know that we can expect about 50 centimeters of sea level rise by 2050 and about 100 centimeters of sea level rise by 2100. And sorry, I can't convert to imperial. I can assess boats in feet, but I can't do it just right now. And so for those, I don't have a map about where we're situated, where Vancouver is, but it's about 5 hours by car north of Seattle. And so this is a map of the city of Vancouver and the floodplain. And so the dark blue is what's vulnerable to a major storm surge today. And then the dark blue and the light blue is what's vulnerable by 2100 to that same storm surge event and 1 meter of sea level rise. And my project focuses in on that circled area, so False Creek, which is really dense urban area in the city. Some people call it the Central Park of Vancouver. It's where people go to recreate, live, work. And so this is the area that I was working in from 2020 to 2022. So I'm going to get to the project itself, Sea to City Design Challenge. It's actually a riff off of Rebuild by Design. I was really fortunate to talk to the staff at New York City, as well as Amy at Rebuild by Design and folks in San Francisco who did Resilient by Design to understand how their project worked and what they would do differently. And so we made a small little Canadian version of RBD and really focused on collaborating being creative, so using this as a container for creativity and risk. Develop a public awareness about sea level rise and coastal flooding, as well as deepen our understanding of host nations' experience and knowledge in this area, and come up with some design concepts. And I should say one of the key learnings from RBD was that you need to spend more time on public engagement. So I actually pulled that out of Sea to City and did that as a year-long project in 2020. And so I did a values elicitation exercise where I asked people what mattered to them in terms of sea level rise and flooding, as well as like adaptation. And so those values got translated into design principles and design criteria that the design teams use to actually build or design the concepts, as well as evaluate how they were doing. So the public used their own values to evaluate the designs. And so that was one element of bringing public participation into what is a very complex subject. And we wanted to also bring people in at the beginning of the question and problem definition, rather than at the end of being like, here's a design, what do you think? As some of the other speakers have been talking, and as I'm sure you all know, we need to bring people around with us on the journey, and also staff. There's so many biases and myths, colonial myths in local government that hold on to old ways of doing. And I wanted to use Sea to City not just as a design experiment or a design challenge, but I also wanted to use it as a change management opportunity where city staff and other experts in the private sector and the regulators could learn along with us and start to think in new ways, because we can't continue to do what we've always done. We need new ways of thinking, and we're going to have to change the people who make those decisions. So I had a fabulous team. I worked with EcoPlan International, which is a firm based in Vancouver who did the engagement and planning work, as well as two fabulous colleagues, Rachel Telling and Margaret Passis, and then these two amazing design teams. And so PWL, who's a Vancouver group, and then MVRDB and co, and then Mithun Plus One, and some of them are at this conference. And I should say that both teams and the project were supported by two cultural advisors, Corey Douglas from the Squamish Nation and Haida Nation, and then also Charlene Alec from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Okay, so here it is. Just like here, we picked 4 sites. We had a 5th site that we just did a one-day charrette on, and so you can see them on the board, just to give a sense. And again, just the timeline. So because RBD tend to work on like a 8 to 9 month timeline, so we took about a year plus another year to do the engagement. So we had 1 round getting started, a 2nd round of just testing new ideas, and then a 3rd round of refining those ideas. And I just wanted to give a sense of like who made up the project and how we included the public, as well as how we attempted to address equity in or operationalize equity in the project. So we had the design teams, we had the city staff, we had a technical group, and then we also had the community advisory group made up of members of the public, as well as a 14-person youth adaptation lab, which was actually inspired by the Berkeley school that did a youth component as part of Resilient by Design. So the youth learned about civic literacy, but also about adaptation, and we're part of the back and forth between the design teams and the city on the design. We did a lot of engagement, and this is up here, and I'll get into other stuff. I'm kind of going through this, but we did like a Conversations in Canoes video series because, you know, it's the pandemic. Who plans an engagement project during a pandemic? I accidentally did, as I'm sure most of you did. And so if you sit at either end of a canoe, it's 2 meters or 6 feet apart. So I did a series of like talking to experts about sea level rise and community values around the topic. Something that was different than conventional local government, coastal adaptation engagement programming is we had a really strong art component. And so we worked with a theater group to have this live theatrical or choral performance where we hosted online 4 artists, one from New York City who lived through Sandy, one from Mumbai, one from Tokyo, and then an Indigenous artist from Vancouver. And they had a conversation about their concerns, hopes, and dreams on the coast with respect to sea level rise and adaptation. And then a youth choir sang that live in Vancouver in one of our study sites that is in the floodplain. And we also used photo voice to get people to articulate their hopes and dreams and feedback on the design. So that's those. And then we also partnered with a Chinese Canadian artist to integrate Taoist and Western science principles and thoughts around coastal living. Oh, I knew this was going to happen. So I'm just going to go for the decolonization work. We put in different languages. We put in different requirements to ensure that the teams, had some experience about decolonization, bringing on cultural advisors. We also created a cultural safety program. We had this Indigenous knowledge value reflection tool that we used to reflect on how we were doing against our Indigenous knowledge value criteria, and that was shared with the nations for some accountability. We also set up a pattern and rhythm of the program where we started with all coming together to attend decolonization workshops, which were talks hosted by members of the host nations before going into all the technical work. And just some outputs is that we created this vision, which was co-written by the cultural advisors. And so it's in a very different tone and a very different perspective. And this will be our vision moving forward when we do coastal adaptation planning. We've never done that before. We also changed our language, which was one of the biggest changes. So we went, we often talk about coastal adaptation in resist, accommodate, and move. And we changed that to how do we acknowledge the water? How do we be good hosts, accommodate it instead of accommodate? And how do we restore relationships to the water and the land and with each other instead of retreat or move? Just finding that language is powerful. It shapes our, ideas, opinions, and decisions. And so we wanted to work to change that. And I think I'm just gonna check. Okay, there we go. So these are some of the visualizations that came out, and they represent like a lot of technical work, like engineering, seismic work, contaminated site, some economic testing, and landscape design. So this is one of the sites in 2050. This is it today. And here is it in 2100. And so this is just like one aspect of its of the visuals. And so really just looking at how to bring back nature. We have a seawall here, a public seawall in Vancouver, which is really popular. How do you still have that experience, make it elevated, retaining some of the buildings as a reminder of our past. And then we also really used Sea to City as a way to integrate ecology. I'm a biologist and I've worked in adaptation for 15 years, and I'm tired of engineering centric ways of doing this work. And we know it often doesn't work in the long term. We've just seen some examples. We need to understand the ecological, functionality of our coastline and work with it, not against it. And so this is just showing how we attempted one of the design teams attempted to showcase that by looking at a cross-section of the intertidal zone up to the upland and then placing the interventions along those different zones. And so this is just showing some of the interventions, and even one of the ideas is to plant a Coast Salish garden. That's the generic name for Indigenous peoples who live along in the Salish Sea area where I'm from. We need to test some of the plants now that we might need to plant in the future because of climate change. And so that was the idea around the Coast Salish garden, but also enhancing the visual presence and technology of Indigenous peoples on the land. And then just showing here on the south side, just kind of like how we changed and how we showed and decolonized our view of places. So this is like a plan view of an area in Vancouver, and the dashed line is the original shoreline. So just looking at how we showed this to the public, how we move buildings beyond or out of the floodplain and visualize alternatives, because quite often we can't imagine what we don't see. And this is another site where we compared, so that's it today. And like, imagine this as a future where we have successfully adapted to rising sea levels, and there's more space for people to recreate, to gather medicines, for ecology, and we still have that shoreline living. And then just the last ones, just again, these are just other visuals of again, 2100 views, and using technology like and important symbols of Coast Salish life, the Western red cedar tree to make berms. And then again, just showing, I think the biggest thing that came out also was the showcasing that flexible adaptation pathways are what Vancouver has to invest in. We have to invest in a shoreline and change our shoreline in a way that it can adapt over time to changing sea levels and risk, and that the future isn't static, it is very dynamic. And so our ways of designing one or two designs to exist, to save us in perpetuity is not realistic. And so that's the final visual. Thank you. Thanks for giving me some extra time. And yeah, I think we'll go to questions. I'll stop sharing.
So yeah, Betsy and David will select speakers, and please use the microphone. I'm sorry, not speakers, people for questions. So please use the microphone for your questions.
So we can take questions from the in-person audience, and if anybody's online and would like to type into the Q&A, we can also take questions that way. So I have a question. Do we still have Chris online by any chance?
I only saw Alex.
Well, he was
not sure.
He was Chris.
That was Chris.
Oh, Alex is Chris, right?
Yeah, he's still here.
Okay, great. So for Betsy and Chris, I'm wondering this idea of the word you used was leadership co-optation, or this idea that some people take over leadership positions.
Elite capture. Yeah.
So is there, and anybody in the audience also, you've all worked in these spaces. How do we avoid that? Is there a way to deal with it? Is it necessarily a bad thing?
I guess what we were hoping to do in our paper is offer that framework and that ladder to have it be a way to open the conversation for solutions for that. We don't have the solution. I'm sorry. We don't have the magic pill to hand out right now. But I feel like having a centered framework or an object, which we were hoping to do with that ladder to begin the discussion between the two groups, can help facilitate solutions that work for a context specific place or within the context and the needs within that place. But yeah, I don't know if there are excellent solutions. So I would love to hear from everyone else as well.
Hi, thanks. First of all, great to see some other sociologists doing this from a more qualitative perspective. I know Elliot's all over the place. Good to see some other names besides James. So, but with regard to elite capture, it's something I think about a lot. So I'm working with mainly municipal governance in New England and these small towns, of course. Many of them depend on coastal tourist economies or coastal home values for their tax revenue, right? And oftentimes you do see this capture, even to the point where, mentioning retreat, was enough to get a town planner fired in one town, right? And so, but in another town, right, you have like a knowledge-based economy because there's a kind of a university there and a hospital, and the elites, in fact, are really pushing against further coastal development, right? And so, you get, I guess, kind of to your point, David, that elite capture maybe isn't always a bad thing, but it depends on what your end goal is, right? Whether or not you're putting ecology first, or the needs of the community, or what have you, right? There are trade-offs involved here, but thank you both for sharing your work. It's very interesting to see. Yeah. Thank you.
I guess Alex and Chris and Angela, if you just want to chime in anytime, just go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, on community leadership, I should say that within Fairbourne, the community we were working with, the leadership was very much self-appointed, but the rest of the community seemed quite happy to follow the quite strong personalities that were stepping up to the plate and taking a lead. I wouldn't say that the rest of the community always agreed with absolutely everything that that those community leaders were doing or were saying, but by and large, they were happy that somebody was doing the work and making efforts on behalf of their community.
Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just had a consideration. I just had a consideration to the previous point. I mean, I guess an obvious thing would be to try to elect people that represent your community in district manager, like as a district manager position or a council member, so that you can leverage more someone that is representing your, ethnicity or which in Rockaway, I'm studying a community in Rockaway here in Queens, and that has been always a big challenge between the east portion of the peninsula and the west portion of the peninsula, where the west portion of the peninsula is always more capable of leveraging money because they're white and they have money. And so, yeah, that's just the point.
Yeah, can I just quickly come back on that? I mean, that tends to assume that the location that you're looking at coincides with an electoral district, and that's not always the case. And I think that would be a problem with the place we were working with, for example. But yeah, that's a very good point.
So this question is also for Betsy, and for anybody else who has thoughts on it, but I'm really interested in this concept of intermediaries. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and we're trying to do a lot of community-based equitable climate adaptation work. And what we've found is that working with community-based organizations can be a really helpful intermediary, but there's also all sorts of challenges around that. As you've been thinking about this kind of intermediary concept, what are the characteristics that you found of a really successful intermediary? Recognizing that it's all context dependent and that there's no one right answer, that would make life too easy. But kind of what are some of the characteristics of a really effective intermediary?
I mean, maybe I'll pull on your Valmeyer case and Dennis Knobloch, who was the mayor of the town. And so he would be situated in our model in the yellow box that overlapped with the green. And he was very influential in talking with the Army Corps of Engineers, and he met with all the different people. And so he had buy-in both with the external actors or the facilitators, the funding releasers for that, and also within his own community. And within that community, they then created their own subcommittees and planning committees. So he was maybe the local leader that helped and was a successful intermediary who then could speak to both sides very effectively, and had trust from both sides, and was very effective in that way. And so that's an individual in a town of 900. I don't know what that would look like, or I don't have an example offhand of what a community organization might look like with that, who would have such high levels of trust on both sides. But it would be, an ideal would be one that has trust on both sides, that can translate the language of both, translate the needs of the community, and also translate the legal, financial, all of the requirements that come along with the facilitators.
So I'll even provide more detail on that. And I agree absolutely with everything you said. Talking to Dennis, he doesn't like to take credit for everything. He likes to credit the people he delegated a lot of this to. In particular, school teacher. There were 2 school teachers who were really critical in pulling the community together, pastors, and a couple of business leaders. There was one particular business. There was a graphic arts, graphic printing service company, and so it's not necessarily just one person, is my point. And the other point I want to make is these people were key people in these institutions that people look to as symbols of the identity of their community, the churches, the schools, and this is a rural case, but you know, in these small rural communities in the Midwest, I do know in New Haven, Connecticut, it's an urban community. It's similar. Your local school is sort of a symbol of your identity. If your school is not functioning, if it's deteriorating or whatever, to school consolidation, there might be, you know, the population of students is declining. People see that as a symbol of the decline of their community, and so if you can get the school on board, the institutions and everything, and people see, oh, well, we can actually try to make something better. We can try to make the town better so that people will move here and we'll have more kids in the school. These are the conversations that were happening in Valmeyer when they were waiting 18 months before they actually broke ground on the first house, which is crucial.
I took this and now I'm like,
can I chip in something? Yeah. So where we were, I think in terms of intermediaries that worked effectively, it tended to be people that were well integrated with the media and could work well with journalists. And I guess it depends on what kind of community you're looking at, whether you're one that's in an advanced phase and is already kind of looking into buyouts and working with local authorities in that space. But for our community, they were hitting a brick wall, and therefore needed the media to come on side to actually get some traction with the local authority. So I think a successful intermediary in that particular case was, you know, very much a personality that was happy and knew how to work with the media effectively.
I just wanted to say, I really appreciate all of the conversation here, and my brain is starting to fizzle out at the end, so I'm not sure what I'm about to say is going to make a lot of sense. But I think there's also, I mean, strong leadership is very important to creating a plan and relocation. But I think to speak to, you know, how do you find that leader, and there's a lot of burnout there too, right? So, and this is a long process. So for example, the community I'm working in, the mayor is on board, like wants to see things happen, but also isn't sure if he wants to be mayor continuously, you know, for the next 25 years. He doesn't want to take that role, and that's asking a lot of leadership. So I think there are some great takeaways from case studies in terms of having those steering committees that can guide the process, that doesn't put, because the reality is that a lot, at least in this case that I'm speaking about, there's a lot of work that has to be done in the community right now that isn't relocation. So council and mayor are required to do everything for the community now, as well as think about the future. And that's a lot to take on in small communities. That intermediary space is something that I myself, and I imagine a few people here that are coming out of academia or are trying to figure out trying to navigate that role. Like, are you a researcher in that space? Are you a consultant in that space? Are you supporting community-based organizations? Do those community-based organizations exist in the space that you're trying to work in? So I really appreciated that, kind of highlighting that space, because I'm not really sure what that space even is right now as these conversations keep going. Okay, and those are comments, but my question really is also thinking about the design work, the vision. As Angela said, people can't imagine a future if they can't see it. And I wonder if part of this cognitive dissonance is that it will always exist, and the risk perception issues will always exist, but designing those opportunities of what future places could look like that do speak to those values that are captured by community through these surveys doesn't take away the fact that people will have to leave their homes, but introducing options for community resilience through visualization in different spaces. Is that something that I guess anyone who has worked in this realm could see as being an opportunity to shift that conversation? That was a lot in sand.
Yeah. So so we looked at several case studies in addition to Valmeyer, Pattonsburg, Rhineland. These are other small towns that were also affected by the 1993 floods that pretty much relocated almost the entire towns. And Valmeyer is, I think, really the most successful. But in all the cases, it wasn't what the importance of leadership was in articulating a vision for how the community could be better, how you could solve a lot of these problems. The very first session, Kristen had mentioned something called intersectional motivations for relocating. And it's when all these things come together, your population is declining, your tax revenue is declining because of farm consolidation in this case. And then this disaster comes along and it just makes everything worse, like much more quickly. And what all three mayors in these cases proposed was like, okay, we can solve this problem if we move closer to the highway, we can get a private developer to come in to put in a shopping mall and create. So they were all projecting a vision of how things could be better, not just reproducing the same community somewhere else, because then you're stuck in the trap of, well, and by the way, the focus groups in Valmeyer, almost everybody agrees they miss the old Valmeyer. So this new town is very nice. It looks like a subdivision, but it's not your small little Midwest town with the the drugstore with the soda counter, which they had. So they have to articulate something that's better, that makes people willing to sacrifice what they have. It's not necessarily a vision.
I think visualizations always help. It's just like, who's steering them, who's doing them, what are they based on, and it has to be very transparent about what is made up, what they're made up of, and they can be an effective tool. I think I've had conversations with farmers, with residents in rural communities and the city, in the city, and we kind of just get through it, or we get to the points of tension, the points of value quicker when we can use these tools, these visualizations to put a box, or to say, oh, this is what you mean. It's like, defining your terms. This is a different way of defining your terms. So I think visualizations are really helpful to have these conversations and to move to the next place that you need to go on this long road of retreating.
This is for Angela. The images were beautiful and really compelling, and I was just kind of curious how, I don't know how hypothetical or moving towards implementation it might be, but whether you'd had interest from other places, because the process seemed really interesting to imitate, and then also if there were any moves towards some sort of implementation of those designs.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I didn't really show it, but we'll quickly, but so from those visualizations, we pulled aspects of them into pilot projects. So we've got about 5 pilot projects to test. And so we're looking at doing one pilot and as part of seismic upgrades to a bridge. And so they have to take down part of the seawall. And so they were like, and because some of the engineers had come through, they had supported Sea to City, they're like, I now look at the shoreline differently, Angela. And they came to me. I didn't know what was happening. And they said, hey, I think there's a space, which was like really awesome on so many levels. So we're looking to pilot like a small section of the seawall, rehabbing it into like tidal terraces. And then I'm working through I hope to do to pilot the habitat benches, which was on the south side, just showing how we can slowly, how we could implement habitat benches over time. And then the city itself is undergoing a process of revising our adaptation strategy. So I'm going to then streamline and pull in aspects of Sea to City so that it gets embedded into our infrastructure and our capital planning processes so that we can secure money for piloting these projects. But I think the way we're going to go about it is we're going to do some piloting and then before we do major implementation. We own a lot of the land the city owns a lot of the land in one part of the floodplain in False Creek. And so I'm hoping to also test some things in there before we mainstream it as part of our requirements of development in the floodplain.
Well, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So you can.
I actually just had a comment on visions, because I'll never forget, I was living in Rotterdam in the Netherlands before, and I went to one of the public meetings that was introducing the idea of a controlled flood or floodable plaza in the city to convoy waters from the rooftops into an open space that was sunken and would function as a playground when it wasn't flooding. And it would keep waters when it was. And in this public meeting, the first iteration of the visions for this floodable plaza included kids on little inflatable boats playing, in the middle of this plaza. And I could see the moms in the meeting. Their instinct of preservation kicked in, and they were like, no, we don't want this, we don't want, are you gonna put guards that will control for kids that may fall in the water? And so the first iteration was completely a mistake. They had to redo the visions and represent the program. So just depends on who you have in the audience too. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to, unfortunately, I'm getting the signal that we're out of time, which is too bad because I wanted to ask if Vancouver's on the way to Climatopia. Thank you, everybody. It's 5 o'clock, and so, thanks for coming. Thank you for being online.